So let's say a few things about Hanukkah, which I really spoke about last week, I think. But anyway, we asked, and this is a very profound question, if the Torah is complete and it covers everything from the beginning of creation to the end of days, what's the necessity of adding additional holidays to the Jewish calendar? Why can't we find whatever it is that Hanukkah infuses in the Torah? So the simple answer is that it adds a new dimensions, or it adds new things that we need to consider. And it teaches us new lessons. And you spoke about some of them, which reflected in the Al HaNisim, that Masarti Giborim b'yad Chaloshim, Rabbim b'yad Ma'atim, Tameim b'yad Tahorim, Rishoyim b'yad Tzadikim, B'zeidim b'yad Oskei Sorosechem. So that covers the full gamut of our enemies, which is present today, and we're fighting the same battles that the Chashmonaim fought. But there's one thing about the Nes of Hanukkah that is extremely mysterious, and that is the miracle of the flask of oil, the Pach HaShemet. Now, we know that we celebrate the victory, which is a physical victory, a victory of arms, a victory of defeating the enemy on the battlefield. But there's also a spiritual dimension that's introduced to us through the miracle of the flask of oil, which was kindled in the Beis HaMikdash in the menorah. The rededicated, refurbished Beis HaMikdash with the new menorah. Actually, at that time, it was a makeshift menorah, and they burnt and the oil lasted for 8 days, a spiritual victory. The problem is as follows. If you read the book of Maccabees, which was written contemporaneously with the events of the story of Hanukkah, there is no mention of the miracle of the Pach HaShemet. There's no mention of the menorah lasting or burning for 8 days with a minute amount of oil. There's no mention of the discovery of one flask of oil that had the Chosem, the seal of the Kohen Gadol. No mention of that. No mention that it lasted for 8 days. That's in the book of Maccabees, which was written contemporaneously with the events. There's no mention of the miracle of the flask of oil in Josephus, which was written approximately 200 years after the battles of Hanukkah, in which event there was plenty of time to have gathered all of the facts and to know exactly what happened and what are the traditions. There's no mention of the miracle of the flask of oil. There's no mention of the miracle of a flask of oil in the Al HaNisim. The Al HaNisim says, we had a victory, like I said before, and everybody else knows what it says there, the many in the hands of the few, etc., etc. It says they kindled lights in your courtyard, but it does not mention they found a flask of oil, which was miraculous, and then they burnt for 8 days, which is miraculous. No mention in the Al HaNisim.
Who wrote Al HaNisim?
The Al HaNisim is already recorded in the Gemara. So it goes back at least to the times of the Tanoim or Meroyim, and they make no mention of the miracle of the flask of oil. How is this to be understood? Those who doubt the miracle, because it's nowhere reflected in any of the texts, say that the rabbis added it later on. They made up this miracle. Why? Because we ultimately got defeated by the Romans, and the Romans burnt our temple. Ultimately, they threw us into the diaspora. They drove us into the diaspora. So we're not going to sit there in the middle of Rome or wherever we are in the diaspora and start talking about our great military victories. First of all, it may make the conqueror think we're trying to foster revolt. So we just downplayed the military victory and we replaced it with this miracle of the flask of oil. And that's what doubters, skeptics, cynics will say about the miracle of the flask of oil. How do we understand?
I think, I might be wrong, but there is a link in the Chumash itself he speaks the Hanukat HaMizbeach
Mishkan.
Le'olam,
Eifo?
forever. I think I must check.
There's only one Mishkan that was Mitchanech, that was the Mishkan, the Mizbeach and the Mishkan.
But it says Hanukat HaMizbeach.
That's the Chanukat HaMizbeach is Chanukah. In the Mishkan, there was a...
But the wording is the same.
Could be, maybe. Okay, I don't remember exactly, but you could be right. I'm not going to argue about that. I'm just going to tell you that we need to understand what is the nature of this nace of the Pach HaShemen, which we believe actually happened, and it was not made up, it was not inserted at a later date. So how do we understand its absence from the holy, from not the holy, but from the contemporaneous texts, and from the Al Hanisim itself? Talking about Al Hanisim, over the miracles that were performed for our ancestors in those days, in the days of the Chashmonaim. So why is it missing? So, like I said before, there are two dimensions to the miracles of Hanukkah. One is the physical miracle, the victory over the enemy, and one is the spiritual miracle of the Pach Hashem and the Flask of Oil. Now the Ramban, who was an early commentator on the Chumash and on the Talmud, was a great scholar of the Middle Ages, wrote a parish on the Chumash, and I think I may have mentioned this last week, and he writes on the sentence, Lo Yosser Shevet Yehuda, when Yaakov Avinu gathered his sons on his deathbed and blessed them, he says, Lo Yos, to Yehuda, when he blessed the tribe of Yehuda, he said, Lo Yosur Shevet Yehuda, the scepter of leadership will not be removed from Yehuda. That means that once David HaMelech, who was the first king of Yehuda, to rule, it will never be removed from the house of David, from the house of Yehuda, from the house of David. So says the Ramban, when the Chashmonaim destroyed the Greco-Syrian armies, and he says they were Chasidei Elyon, tremendously pious people, She'imoleihem nishkachach haTorah v'hamitzvah miYisrael, for it were not for the Chashmonaim, we today would have no memory of Torah and mitzvahs. Actually, we would have been totally assimilated. There would be no Jewish people. There was no Torah. There would have been no mitzvahs. And yet, they became Sadducees. And yet, they were all wiped out by Herod, Hurdas, HaRasha. So, the Ramban says, why did this happen to these great pious people that saved Judaism? Answer the Ramban gives is because they usurped the Malchus. They took upon themselves to be the kings. And because of that, they had a terrible ending. Their generations down through time, 4 or 5 generations, became Sadducees, even perhaps earlier, and ultimately in the 6th generation they were killed. So we need to understand this casts, I might say, a shadow over the story of Hanukkah. Here the heroes of the story of Hanukkah become Sadducees. How can we give them credit for saving the Torah and the mitzvahs from Israel when ultimately they abandoned the Torah and the mitzvahs and became Sadducees? This, I think, is what the miracle of the flask of oil addresses. Now, all the people who lived at the time of the miracle of Hanukkah, yes?
But Josephus Flavius,
right?
He couldn't care less.
Yes, he could.
Why?
Because he wrote a parish on the Chumash. I mean, he didn't write it specifically, but in his history of the Jews, he starts with Adam HaRishon. He goes through all of the Chumash.
Okay, so then
and he lists. He has his own parish, which probably he got from the scholars of his day, which explains certain things in the Torah that otherwise were not explained. He was considered a traitor because he advocated peace. He was a shalom machshavnik. And the people at the time felt that was not the proper. We're in the middle of a war, we're fighting the Romans. It's not a time for shalom achshav, it's a time to rally around the army of Israel, the defenders of Israel. It's not a time to preach peace. So they considered him a traitor,
So why
a
Avrum?
political traitor.
Why Avrum is not considered treason?
Oh, Yavne was when Jerusalem was falling, and that was the handwriting was on the wall. The Biryonim were not allowing a surrender to the Romans that everybody advocated, because they saw that the war was a futile effort and they were all going to get killed or carried off into slavery. The temple would be destroyed. They thought maybe we could save the temple. The Biryonim, the zealots of their day, whatever, the political zealots, wouldn't allow it. Okay, but that was already at the very, very end. Anyway, Josephus was considered a traitor for political reasons, not for spiritual reasons necessarily. Anyway, so it's a plea, it's a wonder that he doesn't mention this miracle. He mentions all the miracles of the Bible. He mentions all the miracles. He mentions the miracle of the battle, of the victory. But he doesn't mention the Pach Hashem. So anyway, what I was saying is after the consideration that is introduced by the Ramban, which was known to the people. In other words, the Ramban didn't just make this up. The command or the will of Yaakov Avinu is written in the Torah. Lo Yasur Shevet Me Yehuda is written in the Torah. How did the Chashmonaim, who the Ramban himself calls Chasidei Elyon, how did they violate this command of Yaakov Avinu that the scepter should not be removed from Yehuda, and they, the Kohanim, made themselves king? How did they do that? Well, the answer is they said, Eis Lasos Lashem Heferu Terasecha. There comes a time, or there comes moments, when in order to preserve the Torah, you need to violate the Torah. For instance, the Talmud is written down, even though it's the Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral law. It was transmitted orally. All of a sudden, at the end of the Amoraic period, they wrote down the Talmud. Why did they write it down? Because if they didn't write it down, because of the dispersion of the Jewish people and the enemies that conquered us and destroyed our houses of study and prohibited the study of Torah, if we would not have written down the oral law, it would have been forgotten. So, Eis Lasos Lashem, there comes a time or a moment in history when you had to write it down in order to preserve the Torah. So too the Chashmonaim. They said, as was mentioned before, the majority of the Jewish people were Misyavnim. They adopted Hellenistic philosophies and Hellenistic practices. Were they not to make themselves the holy priests, the kings, the political people of the time would not have risen to the task of preserving the Torah. They were Hellenists. They curried favor in the eyes of the conquerors and in the eyes of the Greek aristocracy. They wanted to be considered equal. They wanted photo ops, as we might say today. So what did they do? They embraced Hellenism. Comes along the Chashmonaim and say, we can't allow the political people to take the helm and lead the people, become, let's call it the governors or the kings of Israel, because they are not up to the task. They're not pure enough. They're not righteous enough. They're not observant enough. And as a result, they usurped the monarchy and made themselves kings. Eis Lasos Lashem. Now, as the Ramban writes ultimately, and we spoke about this last week, if you step outside of the normal boundaries of the halacha, ultimately it breeds disrespect for the halacha, and ultimately they lost their fervor for halacha, and they lost their adherence to halacha, and they became Sadducees.
How long can Horat Sha'ah last?
That's the point. What is the terminology? Hora'at, it's a teaching, or it's an establishment of a halacha. Lisha'ah, for the moment. In other words, as long as the crisis persists, you can follow the Hora'at Sha'ah. But if the crisis subsides, and after the Chashmonaim dedicated the Beis HaMikdash, and after they rid the country of the Greco-Syrian armies, and there was a flourishing of Talmudic study, the Mishnah was ultimately written, the Talmud has followed that, there was a rejuvenation of Jewish spirituality, because again the rabbis banned the Greek language from Judaism, banned the writings of the Greeks from Judaism, banned practices from Judaism of Hellenistic practices, and ultimately there was a resurgence of spirituality and observance of Torah, to the effect that there were thousands upon thousands of teachers, and there was great academies that studied Torah, and the Mishnah was written, and the Talmud was written and studied, etc. That's when the Sha'ah ended.
But didn't the war last 30 years? Or
25 years.
Okay, 25. At the end of which they were killed.
Right.
So
Actually, it was the last of the Chashmonaim who made himself king, Shimon.
Yes.
And then he gets killed.
But the Horat Shah finished after 25 years.
Oh, I don't know if it lasted 25 years. It lasted more until there was a rejuvenation and a resurgence of spirituality and Talmudic study. Well, the Mishnah was written. Righteous people, don't second guess them. Don't really try to judge them, at least not at that point in time when the miracles they brought about and the salvation of the Torah and the mitzvahs. How do we know that this was a good thing? How do we know that even though ultimately they discredited themselves and ultimately they became Sadducees, how do we know that it was a good thing at the moment? How do we know that this is a spiritual revival that is blessed and not something that is just, like we said before, kanois, just zealotry that sputtered out and didn't last long? How do we know that God appreciated their sacrifice? He blessed us with the miracle of the Pach HaShemen. The Pach HaShemen was a vindication of the behavior of the early Hasmoneans. It wasn't mentioned because in the temple there were miracles of not maybe equal stature, but of similar stature. And God didn't have to make this miracle except to teach us that the Hashmonoim were Hasidei Elyon, and don't second guess them because of what their descendants ultimately did. And that is that is a message of Hanukkah. We don't have prophets. We don't have people that can tell us this rabbi is a great tzaddik and this rabbi follow his teachings and this rabbi don't follow his teachings, or do this, do that, don't do this, don't do that. We have no way of knowing. How does God reveal his hand? How does he teach us as to what is spiritual and what is important and what we should emulate? It's through the unfolding events of history. We judge in retrospect, in hindsight. Let's talk, for just for a second, to give you an example. Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah, in the early 1600s. Shabtai Tzvi, the false Messiah. When he first appeared on the scene, he bamboozled the rabbis. People thought that he was the Messiah. People sold their homes, their businesses, and packed up and prepared to go to Israel because they thought Shabtai Tzvi was the Messiah and he was going to lead a return to our land. Oh, but ultimately his behavior deteriorated, and they realized that they made a grave mistake. At least the majority, the overwhelming majority, realized they made a grave mistake. What's amazing to me is there are Shabtai Tzviniks that persisted for quite a number of years even after his failures. But the point I'm trying to make is that initially everyone thought he was a big tzaddik. He was probably very brilliant. He was extremely charismatic. And he captured the imagination of the people in the midst of their terrible suffering from the Gentiles. And as a result, they embraced his movement as a messianic movement. But it turned out to be wrong. How do we know it turned out to be wrong? Because the unfolding events of history revealed to us that it was wrong. There was no lightning that came out of heaven. No baskol, no heavenly voice proclaimed him wrong. It was just unfolding events of history. The rest of the story revealed to us that he was wrong. If we take that as an example, perhaps we could say that the story of Hanukkah, the unfolding events of the rest of the history, teaches us that the Hashmonaim became Sadducees. Do we embrace them as heroes? We certainly discredited Shabtai Tzvi. Do we embrace the Hashmonaim as heroes? Comes along HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and through the unfolding event of the mace of the Pach HaShemen, he tells us, yes, the Hashmonaim were Hasidei Elyon. They were very pious. And because of them, the Torah was preserved. Don't judge by looking down the road, judge at the moment.
So why don't say in Alanissim?
because the Al Hanisim was contemporary. Contemporary, it made no great rash because there were other miracles in the temple. It's only in the hindsight that took place when the 6 generations later, when they became tzedukim, and ultimately the Horus kills them all, that's when it became questionable. Does history teach us they were wrong? So we then resurrect and recall that at the time there was a great miracle in the Beis HaMikdash. That the candle, I wouldn't say candles, it wasn't candles, but the oil of the menorah lasted for 8 days to teach us, God revealing to us through that event in history, that the miracle of the Chashmonaim was a miracle of great spiritual value.
Excuse me, Herod was before current era.
Herod was before the Christian current era.
But Talmud.
Talmud was after, but the Mishnah.
So they knew already.
What do you mean? In the Talmud, they knew already. That the Talmud says May Chanukah, and it talks about the Bnei of the Pach Hashem. It appears in the Talmud. It doesn't appear in earlier, the contemporaneous text. Anyway, everybody should have a Freilich Chanukah. Eat up. Don't leave over any of the sufganiyot because there are chametz, and soon it's going to be Pesach. And so I wish you all a happy Chanukah, a spiritual Chanukah. And the miracle of the Pach Hashem is to reinforce in our minds the spiritual nature of the battle of Chashmonaim.